He told everyone she was mentally ill. It was the only way to keep her quiet. And by the time she realized what he was doing to her, 3 different doctors had already signed paperwork that said she couldn't be trusted with her own mind. Her own mother believed him. Her own assistant stopped taking her calls. And the woman standing in the mirror, the one everyone now whispered about at dinner parties, didn't even recognize herself anymore. This is the story of how a husband tried to erase his wife from her own life, and how she came back from the one place nobody expects a comeback to start. Her name was Sarah Kessler, and 2 years before any of this began, she was the kind of woman people described as unshakable. She ran her father's architecture firm in Portland, a company he'd built from a single drafting table in 1987 into one of the most respected design studios on the West Coast. She had married Daniel Voss 6 years earlier, a smart, charming financial consultant who slid into her family like he'd always belonged there. Her father trusted him. Her mother adored him. And Sarah, for a long time, believed she'd found the rare kind of partner who made her life bigger instead of smaller. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Daniel had spent those 6 years quietly studying her. Not loving her. Studying her. Learning which of her habits could be twisted into evidence, which of her words could be recorded and replayed out of context, which people in her life could be turned, slowly, into witnesses against her. It started small, the way these things always do. A missing bracelet Sarah swore she'd left on the dresser. A dinner reservation she was certain she'd made, that somehow didn't exist. A conversation she remembered having with Daniel that he insisted, calmly, gently, had never happened at all. Every time, he'd tilt his head with that same patient, concerned expression, the one that said, "I'm not judging you. I'm just worried about you." And every time, Sarah found herself apologizing for something she was almost sure she hadn't done. She didn't know yet that Daniel had a key made for her jewelry box. She didn't know he'd called the restaurant himself and canceled the reservation 40 minutes before they were supposed to leave. She didn't know that the conversation she remembered so clearly had, in fact, happened exactly the way she remembered it, and that Daniel was lying to her face with the same steady voice he used to order coffee. This wasn't confusion. This was architecture. Daniel was building something, brick by brick, inside his wife's own sense of reality, and he was doing it so carefully that even Sarah, sharp as she was, couldn't see the walls going up around her until she was already standing inside them. The real reason came out slowly, the way rot always does, hidden until the smell gives it away. Sarah's father, Robert, had structured his estate so that the firm and the family trust would pass to Sarah outright, but only if she remained, in the language of the trust documents, of sound mind and body. It was standard legal boilerplate, the kind of clause most families never think twice about. Daniel had read it differently. Daniel had read it as an instruction manual. Because here was the truth Daniel had discovered 18 months into the marriage. Robert's firm wasn't just successful. It was sitting on nearly total control of a lucrative $12 million redevelopment contract for a stretch of downtown waterfront. A contract that would only mature into full payout in 3 years, and only if Sarah remained the controlling partner. If anything happened to Sarah's legal capacity before then, per an old buy-sell clause Robert had never bothered updating, control would default to her spouse as her designated agent. Daniel had found the clause buried in a document nobody had read carefully in a decade. And once he found it, he stopped seeing Sarah as his wife and started seeing her as an obstacle with a due date. The plan he built was almost elegant in how quiet it was. No poison, no violence. Nothing that would ever show up as a crime in the traditional sense. Just doubt. Just enough doubt, applied consistently enough, for long enough, that eventually the people around Sarah would stop asking whether Daniel was lying and start asking whether Sarah was well. He began feeding her tea before bed, the same chamomile blend she'd always loved, except now it carried a few extra milligrams of a sedative he'd sourced through a pharmacy contact 2 states away, someone who owed him a favor from years back and never asked questions. Not enough to knock her out, just enough to leave her groggy in the mornings, foggy in meetings, prone to the kind of small verbal stumbles that, on their own, meant nothing, but that Daniel began quietly cataloging like evidence in a trial only he knew was happening. He started keeping what he called his concern journal, neatly dated entries describing incidents that ranged from real but exaggerated to completely invented. Sarah snapped at the barista again today. Sarah forgot picking up her mother from the airport, had to be reminded 3 times. Sarah accused me of things I never said, seems paranoid lately. He wrote these entries the way a lawyer writes a deposition, with an audience in mind. And the audience, when the time came, would be a psychiatrist Daniel had already chosen. His cousin, Dr. Aaron Voss, a licensed clinician 200 miles away in Sacramento who owed Daniel money from a failed business venture and who Daniel knew wouldn't ask too many questions if the story arrived prepackaged and convincing. For months, Sarah felt herself slipping without understanding why. She'd walk into her own conference room and blank on a client's name she'd known for years. She'd wake up at 3 in the morning with her heart pounding, certain she'd forgotten something urgent, unable to remember what. She started apologizing constantly. She started doubting her own memory in front of colleagues. She started, for the first time in her adult life, wondering if something was actually wrong with her. And Daniel was right there every single time, patient, loving, endlessly supportive, suggesting maybe you should talk to someone, sweetheart, just to be safe. The escalation began at her mother's 60th birthday party, a night that should have been warm and easy and instead became the first time Sarah watched her own family look at her like she was a stranger. Daniel had spent the weeks before quietly calling relatives, one by one, under the guise of concern. To her mother, he framed it as I just want to make sure she's okay. She's been under so much pressure at the firm. To her college friend Marisol, he framed it as she's been saying some really strange things lately. I didn't want to worry you, but I think you should know. To Sarah's own executive assistant at the firm, Lena, he sent a single email, warm and worried in tone, asking her to please keep an eye on Sarah and let him know if anything seemed off. By the time the party happened, an entire invisible network of people had already been quietly primed to interpret Sarah's every gesture through a lens Daniel had built for them without her knowledge. So when Sarah, exhausted, sedated without knowing it, slightly stumbled over her own toast to her mother and lost her train of thought for a few seconds, the room didn't see a tired woman having an off night. They saw exactly what Daniel had spent months preparing them to see. Her mother pulled her aside afterward, eyes wet with worry, and asked if she was taking care of herself. Marisol texted her the next day, gentle and careful, asking if she wanted to talk about anything at all. And Sarah, who had done nothing wrong, found herself comforting the people who were supposed to be comforting her, promising everyone she was fine. She was just tired. Work had been a lot. Lately, that night, alone in her study long after Daniel had gone to bed, Sarah made a decision that would end up saving her life, though she didn't know it yet. She started writing everything down, every strange gap in her memory, every conversation Daniel had denied, every small, sharp feeling that something around her didn't add up. She kept the notebook hidden inside a hollowed-out architecture reference book on the highest shelf of her office closet, a place Daniel had never once shown interest in. It was in that notebook, 3 weeks later, that Sarah wrote the sentence that changed everything. What if it's the tea? She'd noticed the pattern almost by accident. The fog was always worst on mornings after nights. She'd had the chamomile blend Daniel insisted on making for her, the one he'd started preparing himself about 4 months earlier, right around the time the memory lapses had started. On a Tuesday night, she poured her cup as usual, waited until Daniel left the kitchen, and instead of drinking it, sealed it in a small mason jar and hid it in the back of her office refrigerator behind a stack of client presentation boards. 2 days later, on a work trip to Seattle that gave her 48 hours away from Daniel's orbit for the first time in months, Sarah drove to an independent toxicology lab she found through a friend of a friend, someone with no connection to her family, her firm, or anyone in Daniel's life. She paid in cash. She used her maiden name on the intake form, and she waited, terrified, for results that would either confirm the quiet horror building in her chest or dissolve it completely and leave her wondering if she really was losing her mind after all. The results came back 7 days later, and they were unambiguous. The tea contained a therapeutic range sedative, the kind typically prescribed for anxiety, present in a dosage far higher than anything Sarah had ever been prescribed for anything, because she had never been prescribed. For anxiety, present in a dosage far higher than anything Sarah had ever been prescribed for anything, because she had never been prescribed anything. She didn't have a prescription for that medication. She had never taken it willingly in her life. This was the first twist, and it was the one that cracked the entire case open, because it meant the fog in her mind wasn't a symptom. It was a weapon. Someone had been drugging her for months, carefully, methodically, and there was only one person with consistent, unsupervised access to that tea. Sarah didn't confront Daniel. Not yet. She understood, with a clarity that felt almost frightening, that if she showed her hand too early, he would simply adjust his story, and given the months of groundwork he'd already laid with her family and colleagues, his version of events would win. So instead, she did something that would have terrified the old Sarah, the one who trusted easily and assumed good faith in people. She started building a case. She hired a private investigator through a firm 200 miles outside Portland, someone with no ties to anyone in her circle, paid for in cash from an account Daniel didn't know existed. One she'd quietly opened at a credit union across town using proceeds from an old freelance project. The investigator's first job was simple. Find out who Daniel had been talking to and what he'd been saying. What came back over the following month was worse than anything Sarah had imagined. And this was the second twist, the one that didn't just confirm the danger, but revealed exactly how deep the betrayal actually ran. Marisol, her closest friend since college, the woman who had texted her so gently after the birthday party, had been talking to Daniel for over a year. Not casually, constantly. Phone records the investigator obtained through legal public channels showed calls between Marisol and Daniel at hours that had nothing to do with concern for Sarah's well-being, calls that started late at night and lasted far longer than any conversation about a worried friend required. And buried in a coffee shop receipt from a trip Sarah remembered clearly, a business trip to Denver 8 months earlier, the investigator found something that broke Sarah's heart in a way the drugging never had. A hotel reservation for two, under Daniel's corporate account, for the exact weekend Sarah had been out of town. Marisol's name was on the guest list as the second occupant. Her husband wasn't just gaslighting her to protect a business scheme. He was doing it with the help of the one person Sarah had trusted to catch her if everything else fell apart. Marisol hadn't been gently checking in on a worried friend after the birthday party. She'd been checking in on Daniel's behalf, feeding him information, helping him calibrate exactly how unstable Sarah appeared to the people around her, all while sleeping with her husband on the side. Sarah sat with that discovery for 3 days before she could function normally again. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was betrayal wearing the face of every person she loved. But she kept going, because underneath the grief was something colder and more useful: clarity. If Marisol had been talked into helping Daniel, maybe Marisol could be talked into unhelping him too, especially if she understood exactly how disposable she actually was to a man who was doing all of this for $12 million in contract control, not for love, and certainly not for her. Sarah arranged to meet Marisol for coffee, playing the part of the fragile, confused wife one more time, letting Marisol believe the performance was working. Near the end of the conversation, gently, almost offhandedly, Sarah mentioned that Daniel had been talking about starting fresh after everything settled down, maybe even relocating for a new opportunity somewhere without ties to Portland, without ties to anyone here. She watched Marisol's face carefully as she said it. She saw the exact moment something cracked behind her friend's eyes, the realization that whatever promises Daniel had made her about a future together were about to evaporate the moment they were no longer useful. 2 days later, Marisol showed up at Sarah's office unannounced, shaking, and told her everything. The affair, the calls, the coordinated campaign to make Sarah appear unstable to her family, to her colleagues, to Robert's old business partners. And most importantly, the plan for what came next. Daniel intended to use Dr. Aaron Voss, his cousin, to produce a psychiatric evaluation that would support an involuntary hold, using the concerned journal as supporting documentation, timed precisely to occur before the redevelopment contract's control clause activated in 3 years, ensuring Daniel would be named Sarah's legal decision-maker for both her medical care and her business interests. Sarah recorded the entire confession on her phone, hidden in her blazer pocket, with Marisol's knowledge and eventual consent. Once she understood the recording was the only thing that could undo the damage she'd helped cause. This was the third twist, the one that revealed the full shape of the trap Sarah had been standing inside for over a year. It wasn't just about being made to look unstable. It was a legal mechanism, engineered months in advance, designed to activate at the exact moment it would do the most financial damage, using a corrupted medical evaluation from a psychiatrist who had every personal incentive to say whatever Daniel needed him to say. Armed with the toxicology report, the recorded confession, and financial records the investigator had pulled showing the debt Dr. Voss owed his cousin, Sarah went to a family law attorney who specialized in exactly this kind of case, a quiet, precise woman named Patricia Ilford who had seen versions of this pattern before, usually in cases involving elderly parents and inheritance disputes. Rarely this deliberately engineered. Against a spouse in her prime. Patricia's advice was simple and cold. Do not confront him yet. Let him move first. Because right now, every piece of evidence Sarah had was defensive. What she needed was for Daniel to actually attempt the commitment scheme on record, in a way that could be definitively unraveled in front of witnesses who couldn't later claim confusion or good intentions. So Sarah did something that required more nerve than anything else in this story. She let the fog get worse. She stopped taking countermeasures, stopped avoiding the tea when Daniel was watching, and let Daniel believe his plan was working exactly on schedule. She let her mother's worry deepen. She stopped taking countermeasures, stopped avoiding the tea when Daniel was watching, and let Daniel believe his plan was working exactly on schedule. She let her mother's worry deepen. She let Lena at the office start quietly documenting incidents at Daniel's request. Incidents Sarah now understood were being collected for a very specific purpose. She played the role Daniel had spent a year writing for her, and she played it perfectly, because now she knew the script. 6 weeks later, Daniel made his move. He arranged what he framed to Sarah's mother as an intervention, a loving family meeting to discuss getting Sarah some help. He'd flown Dr. Aaron Voss in from Sacramento under the guise of a family friend with psychiatric expertise, ready to conduct what looked like an informal evaluation, but was actually the first legal step toward an involuntary hold. Robert, Sarah's father, elderly and worried sick after months of hearing concerning reports from people he trusted, had reluctantly agreed to attend, torn apart by the idea that his daughter might be unwell and terrified of doing nothing. Sarah walked into that meeting in her parents' living room already knowing exactly what was about to happen, because Marisol, still cooperating, had warned her the day before. And this time, Sarah wasn't walking in unarmed. Daniel opened the meeting exactly the way Sarah expected, warm, sorrowful, describing a wife he loved so much it was breaking his heart to watch her struggle. He introduced Dr. Voss as a respected family friend who happened to specialize in exactly these kinds of situations, purely coincidentally, purely to help. He gestured toward his concern journal, months of entries, and began reading selected passages aloud in a voice thick with performed grief. Sarah let him finish. She let the whole room feel the full weight of his performance. And then, calmly, she placed 3 things on the coffee table in front of her father, her mother, and a stunned Dr. Voss, who clearly hadn't been told there would be resistance in the room. The first was the toxicology report from the independent lab, showing months of unauthorized sedative exposure with no matching prescription anywhere in her medical history. The second was a printed transcript, alongside the audio file itself, of Marisol's full confession, including the details of the affair, the coordination with Daniel, and the specific plan to use Dr. Voss's evaluation as a legal trigger for the buy-sell clause in Robert's estate documents. The third was a letter from Patricia Ilford, already filed that morning with the county recorder's office, formally putting the estate's buy-sell clause on legal notice and naming Dr. Voss's financial relationship with Daniel as grounds to disqualify any evaluation he produced from being used in any legal or medical proceeding involving Sarah. The room went silent in a way Sarah would later describe as the loudest silence she'd ever experienced. Her mother's hand went to her mouth. Her father's face changed from confusion to something harder, something Sarah hadn't seen since he'd fired a business partner for embezzlement decades earlier. And Daniel, for the first time in over a year, had absolutely nothing prepared to say. This was the turning point, the moment the entire architecture of Daniel's plan collapsed under its own weight, because everything he'd built depended on nobody in the room ever seeing behind the curtain at the same time. Sarah had just pulled the curtain down in front of every single witness who mattered. Dr. Voss left the house within minutes, later formally withdrawing any involvement in an evaluation he now understood could destroy his license if it ever proceeded. Marisol, present at Sarah's request, confirmed everything out loud, tearfully, in front of Robert and Sarah's mother, ending whatever fragments remained of 2 decades of friendship, but closing the last possible escape route for Daniel's version of events. The consequences moved quickly after that. Robert, devastated but decisive, immediately moved to restructure the firm's ownership documents with emergency legal counsel, permanently removing any spousal default clause from the buy-sell agreement. Sarah filed for divorce within the week, citing the toxicology findings and the recorded confession as part of the public record, and referred the drugging itself to the district attorney's office, where prosecutors, presented with lab results and a documented pattern of unauthorized medication, filed charges against Daniel for administering a substance without consent, a felony in the state of Oregon carrying real prison time. The redevelopment contract, the entire $12 million reason this nightmare had been engineered in the first place, remained fully under Sarah's control, now protected by legal language specifically written to prevent exactly this kind of manipulation from ever happening to anyone else in her family's company again. But the resolution Sarah wanted wasn't just legal. It was public, because Daniel hadn't only attacked her in private. He had spent over a year quietly convincing an entire community that Sarah Kessler was unstable, unreliable, someone to be managed rather than trusted. That reputation didn't disappear just because a judge dismissed a commitment petition that never fully materialized. It had to be dismantled in the same public space it had been built. 3 months after the confrontation in her parents' living room, Sarah stood at her father's company's annual stakeholder dinner, an event attended by clients, partners, longtime employees, and several of the same relatives and family friends Daniel had spent a year quietly recruiting into his story. She had prepared exactly one statement, and she delivered it without notes, without her voice shaking, in the same steady tone she used to close multi-million-dollar contracts. She told them the truth. All of it. The tea. The journal. The affair. The evaluation that never happened because it was never legitimate in the first place. She didn't ask for pity. She didn't perform grief for the room the way Daniel had once performed it so effectively. She simply laid out the facts, calmly, completely, and let over 100 people who had once quietly doubted her sanity sit with the reality of exactly what had actually been happening behind the warm, concerned smile of a man they'd all trusted. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment, and then her father stood up first, followed by nearly everyone else in the room, not in applause exactly, but in a kind of collective, wordless acknowledgement that they had all, in their own way, been part of a story someone else had written for them, and that the real Sarah, the one standing in front of them now, was the only true version that had ever existed. Daniel eventually took a plea deal on the drugging charge, avoiding trial but accepting a felony conviction and 18 months in state custody, along with a permanent restriction from any financial role at Sarah's family firm. Dr. Voss surrendered his medical license voluntarily rather than face a board investigation that would have almost certainly ended it anyway. Marisol moved out of state, and Sarah, months later, found she felt something closer to sorrow for her than hatred, understanding that manipulation, once it takes root in a person's life, tends to spread to everyone standing close enough to be useful. Sarah kept the firm. She kept the contract. She kept, eventually, her mother's trust and her father's pride, though both of them carried a quiet guilt for a long time afterward that Sarah worked gently to help them release. And she kept something else too, something Daniel had spent a year trying to convince the world she'd lost. She kept her mind clear, intact, and finally, completely her own again. The last time anyone from that old life saw Sarah Kessler in public was at the ribbon cutting for the finished waterfront development 18 months later, a project that had once been the secret engine behind an elaborate plan to erase her. She stood at the podium in the same steady voice, cutting the ribbon on a building that would stand long after every lie Daniel Voss had ever told about her had been forgotten. Because in the end, the people who try to convince the world you've lost your mind are usually the ones most afraid of what you'll do once you prove you never lost it at all.